Let's go to the Chargers, though. The Chargers were one of the most complicated teams for me to project. They're incredibly exciting. I went over to the RotoViz pace tool in looking at how fast-paced they've played the last few years. They've been well above league average in plays per game, extremely above average in 2020, a little bit lower last year, but still well above average. You have to expect a fast-paced team. Last year, the big shift was towards a pretty pass-heavy approach from the year prior, which obviously was Justin Herbert's rookie year. Their pass rate over expected very high. Their overall pass rate very high because their expected pass rate was itself high. One of the highest pass rates in the league. A lot of plays, a lot of volume. Justin Herbert looks like an absolute star. We've talked about that throughout the offseason. I keep mentioning, it feels like I keep mentioning the last time we saw him was one of the best quarterback games of the year last year, week 17 against the Raiders. He converted something like 6 or 7 fourth downs in the fourth quarter and into overtime. He was tremendous in huge spots over and over and over again. I find myself really wanting to be on this team. We know they're aggressive from fourth down decision-making. We know they're aggressive from play volume. I just said that I went to the RotoViz pace tool. And one of the things I wrote about in my off-season Stealing Signals post talking about the Chargers was you can kind of split it up however you want, and they look great. You look at situation neutral, they're among the league leaders. You look at just raw seconds per snap, they're among the league leaders. You look at first half or second half of games, they're among the league leaders. And when you go into these different types of splits, you see some teams that every team plays a little faster in the second half, right? Because on average, because they're going to have some games where they're in up-tempo situations. So it's adjusted to the league average. They also play faster. They also rank among the league leaders on both sides, right? So they're playing fast early. They're playing fast late. They're playing fast in situation neutral situations. They're playing really fast. I think it was when they're trailing by 7 or more. They get super aggressive when you should, right? So they show this segmented profile that's like this team is playing with pace very deliberately. That's a very positive thing. That's something I want to be on. We know from Brandon Staley's discussions with the media that he's in on analytics. He's in on aggressiveness, fourth down conversion rate, all of those things I mentioned, and the pass happiness to go along with it, with the pass rate over expected last year. Justin Herbert looks like a star. And yet, there are not any players in this passing game that I feel amazing about their price. Justin Herbert is going off at the QB2 in most formats right now. I pretty strongly prefer Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray because of their massive rushing ability. If you look at my projections, you'll see that Herbert comes out quite a bit lower, to the extent that I actually took Herbert out of my top tier of quarterback because I have them projected super fast pace and I have him at really high efficiency as a passer. In 6-point per passing TD leagues, he looks better. In 4-point per passing TD leagues, which is what I'm kind of basing my rankings off, number one, he is mobile, but he's not going to provide enough rushing value to contend with Lamar Jackson or Kyler Murray or Josh Allen. And number two, we do have a little bit lower of a track record. There is a little bit of risk there compared to somebody like Patrick Mahomes, who, yes, Patrick Mahomes has a lot of turnover in his pass-catching group, but we know Patrick Mahomes is elite, and he's elevated the depth-adjusted efficiency of every guy's play. Byron Pringle and all these random dudes. Everyone hates Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman's per-target efficiency rates are through the roof. And that's the case of basically everyone who's played with Mahomes. Not just Kelsey and Hill, but they are for Kelsey and Hill as well. So still feel very confident about what Mahomes is and what the Chiefs' offense is as well. Chargers are very similar, right? The quarterback isn't necessarily mobile. We think they're going to be up-tempo. We think they're going to throw a lot, but they haven't thrown nearly as much. They're 3.8% to the positive in pass rate over expected last year. The Chiefs have been 7 or more for 4 straight seasons, all of Mahomes' career. So almost double that basically every single year. I think the Chargers could still be that type of pass aggressive, but I'm saying that we have a little less certainty that they're going to be that pass heavy. All of which is to say, I do want to be very much on their offense, but Herbert is a guy at his price that I have a hard time playing, and he's the one that makes sense to play when you don't love all of the pass weapons. So there's basically 2 questions I want to ask you here. One is very specifically about the Chargers. The second is a big picture strategy question for you. When you have a team that you've identified like this that you definitely want to be in on, but all of the individual players have ADPs that you're not necessarily in love with, what do you do? Because there are two paths that I can see. The first is saying, this is a weighted bet I want to make. Even though I think very positively what the Chargers could be, I have to acknowledge that I could be wrong about that. I don't like any of the individual prices, so I've identified a spot where I'm going to be pretty out on the Chargers, make a bet against them, and basically acknowledge that I'm not always going to be right. The second is I've identified something here that I want to absolutely exploit, and even though the rest of the market has, and I think their individual players are very pricey, I still need to figure out the players that I think are the best values and make sure to get exposure to them. And really quickly, I'll just run through with Keenan Allen. I've talked a lot about how his efficiency's dropped the last couple of years. His targets per out run was down last year. I think he can still be very good in this offense for all of the offensive reasons I said, but I don't love his price. Mike Williams, last year, sort of a breakout year, but late career, long track record of not being a huge target earner, and also wasn't like elite last year. I like Mike Williams the best out of any of these guys. I have him ranked over Keenan Allen. I think he's the one that has the potential to really explode, especially if Keenan Allen is kind of falling off. But neither of those guys have a profile that screams to me, especially with Mike Williams' long-term track record of not really being an elite target earner. He basically last year finally jumped into like pretty good target earning ability, and he's going very high as well. But he has the ADOT, the air yards. He has the TD potential. And then behind them, I'm not super in on Josh Palmer. I'm concerned maybe I'm missing something there. Jalen Guyton is just a wind sprinter. I've talked about DeAndre Carter a little bit in my offseason stealing signals as a guy that they brought in as this kick returner type who has a little bit of receiving work in his background, that super, super deep sleeper that if he beats out Jalen Guyton and gets into the rotation, maybe DeAndre Carter is interesting in this offense. Gerald Everett's a tight end we've always liked, but Donald Parham is getting a lot of buzz in camp, and I think he's a very good tight end as well. So you have multiple good tight ends, which is potentially an issue for either of them getting enough routes and enough targets. So the first question, just broadly, when you have an offense that you really, really like, and you don't love necessarily any of the pieces at their prices, their individual profiles, because you talked about how good you are, and I completely agree at identifying these breakout profiles. If you've identified none of these individual profiles are necessarily what you want, I think the easy answer is play it through the QB, but I'm also talking about an offense where I don't think the QB is an appropriate cost-adjusted bet. Which avenue do you take? Do you say, maybe I'm wrong on the team level stuff and I'm not going to bet on this team because they're so expensive, or do you go out of your way to get exposure?
Yeah, this is the reason why I wanted to start with the Chargers, because I think they are, in so many ways, the trickiest team, even though they're very straightforward, right? Because when you have Austin Eckler, he's the workhorse. You have those two wide receivers. They're going to be the target hogs. You have what you described there in terms of the pace. And I appreciate you mentioning the pace tool. I really love that. Among the suite of tools that we have, Connor O'Driscoll just put out a fantastic article using that to help you project pace and pass volume for teams in 2022. A really cool piece that I encourage everybody to read. The thing that jumps out to me here is that when I'm looking at your projections, you have Patrick Mahomes at 5,077 yards and 36.6 touchdowns. You have Herbert at 48, 85, and 34.6. So, I mean, obviously within the same general range, but you are projecting Mahomes for more points. And I have this QB price article about to release on the site going over some of the moves that we're seeing in ADP. And it was specifically sparked by the draft that you and I did, where we were able to get both Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott 16 spots below ADP. So then the question is, well, I mean, is this a trend for more or less all the quarterbacks? And to an extent it is, but there are definitely some exceptions, and there are some interesting prices that you can look at. One of the things that we are seeing is that even though there's a very tiny fall, I mean, Justin Herbert has been a quarterback who has held his ADP very, very consistently throughout the entire offseason. You now have Lamar Jackson, a guy that we've been promoting since the beginning. So I feel pretty good about that listeners who purchased him when we had those discussions are at least gaining a little bit of ADP value right now. Whether or not that turns into actually being a league winning play is still, up to what actually happens this year. But Patrick Mahomes started at the very beginning as more expensive than Herbert, and he has fallen the entire offseason to where he's now really quite a bit less expensive. And when I look at that and I think about the things that you just mentioned and the fact that you have Mahomes projected above him, I do think that Mahomes is a very good pick if you're going to pick any of the elite QBs, just because the price is really not taking into consideration, I think, the scenarios that could play out in quite the right way. And one of the reasons that I think that Mahomes has this potential for a massive season, and granted, I mean, when you're projecting him at 5,000 yards, I mean, that's a very good, aggressive season just to start with, right? Now, again, anybody who, one of the things that we all have to do, and that we've had a little bit of a, obviously a full year at this point to do it, but we are now a 17 game season as opposed to a 16 game season. That does matter when we're looking at what the final numbers are.
And we should also note that I assume health, and I get a little aggressive with efficiency. I noted in my release the projections, I'd think of them more like a 60th percentile or maybe even 70th percentile outcome for most players. But yeah.
And I think that I mean, there are so many different ways to do the projections, and there's so much debate about that. I think that the way that you're describing right there is the most useful for drafting,
because we want that upside. Like, we want to know what's possible, right?
Yeah, and if we knock down everybody and compress the outcomes slightly, because we know there actually are going to be a lot of injuries, then you get more accurate and less useful. At least that's my take on it.
That's my approach. 100%. Said it so well.
So one of the reasons that I think Mahomes can blow up is because he has so many different ways for that to happen. And one of the things I did want to ask you about next are sort of your target projections for the Chiefs, because you have Travis Kelce projected, I believe, for 154 targets, 150 some, and MVS and Sky Moore both in the 80s. I think especially with Sky Moore, I think that could end up being more or less right, but the way that they manifest is going to be, well, number one, I think he's actually going to blow by that. I should state that in the first place.
I think so too.
But then if it ends up being correct, those targets will be weighted to the most valuable part of the season. And one of the things that's strange to me as I'm looking at the ADP tracking for these quarterbacks is to see Mahomes continuing to fall, even as MVS generated rave reviews in the summer. And since training camp has started, Juju Smith-Schuster and Sky Moore have generated rave reviews. All three of those guys cannot be awesome and have Patrick Mahomes have the kind of season that he's being priced at. That simply will not happen, right? And so from that perspective, I'm surprised. The other reason, and this we get into kind of fantasy tactics, and Ben, you know that I probably am a little bit less aggressive, or maybe not aggressive, but less focused on some of the stacking elements than a lot of fantasy managers are. But there's no question that playing scenarios and playing specific games and outcomes, specifically in some contests, is a very important element of it. And so if you're looking at drafting Patrick Mahomes, you have a lot of different ways that you can do that in a draft and not necessarily have to reach, and a lot of different ways that you could potentially be right with Travis Kelce and then those three wide receivers you mentioned, even that Hardman could factor in here. That gives you a lot of flexibility. When I'm looking at the Chargers and I'm looking at Keenan Allen and Mike Williams as solid round 3 prices, and then Justin Herbert also very expensive, and you're then also thinking of, okay, this week 17 game, one of the reasons why these guys are expensive is that people are excited about playing Chargers Rams in week 17, but the most important Rams pieces are also either overly expensive or have this huge amount of risk attached, because obviously Matthew Stafford is the way to play this game from the quarterback side potentially serious shoulder injury. So now you're kind of locked into playing Herbert if you want to get exposure to that game and minimize your risk and exposure to the Stafford shoulder. All of that makes, I think, the Chargers much more difficult to play, because when you're looking at Keenan Allen and you mentioned the declining metrics or the potential for a little bit of the decline, and you're looking at Mike Williams, I don't see within the offense other players to soak up all of the excess volume that still is there when you talk about the Chargers as being a heavy pass rate team and a very, very aggressive team. I mean, you have Justin Herbert projected for over 700 dropbacks. And if he's going to drop back 705 times, then there have to be players out there to soak up all of that volume. Now, the one thing you think to yourself is that, okay, even though the type of season that would create for Keenan Allen or Mike Williams is above what they've done historically, that still would be possible. I mean, we could be seeing Keenan Allen or Mike Williams as the 2022 Cooper Kupp, where because you have this context with an elite quarterback and an aggressive offense and players who are good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the talent level of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. And those guys are well above average players who could, in this kind of perfect storm scenario, make a jump. Then maybe at their third round prices, we should be in on them. One of the reasons that I have a ton of Gerald Everett is simply that he seems like the only guy who could kind of, not exactly come out of nowhere, but could finally hit his stride and soak up a lot of this volume. But unfortunately, it doesn't even necessarily seem like he's the tight end in camp who is generating, notes from the beat writer. So then again, you're like, I mean, Donald Parham may be a red zone threat, but that's not a player that, you would necessarily expect to take this excess volume. I think that Josh Palmer is probably a really good way to play this team. I don't have a ton of him. He's always kind of in that range where I still prefer one or two other players that I'm loading up on. And so I think he makes sense tactically, but I'm not necessarily getting a lot of him myself. That part of it, I think, is interesting because once you go through and you look at the individual players on the Chargers, then even though this offense is so dynamic, there are some real drawbacks to trying to incorporate the individual players into your 2022 fantasy teams. And as a result, I don't have as much as I would like because I think you have to have some exposure to these types of teams. But unfortunately, the pricing, and I think with the receivers, one of the things that we're seeing is that because the third round is so dead, I mean, there's nowhere for Keenan Allen or Mike Williams to go. It's not like they can get less expensive and you could at some point get them at a little bit of a discount to where they can beat their ADP. I mean, they really have to go out and have not a Cooper Kupp season, but they have to make a jump to where they have a season that is well outside of what they have done historically to really make sense where they're being drafted. I think the player that I like there is that Mike Williams, as I look into this, I think that the mitigation of what looked like it was going to be a massive breakout season for him really did happen as a result of injuries. He gets hurt after about the first month. He plays through some of that. And if you play through a serious injury, then as opposed to simply getting a per game rate of this, that, and the other thing, and all the statistics, fantasy points and all of the other peripherals that go into, all of the great projections, then you're just out there not getting targeted because you're playing hurt. And so you don't look like the same player. I think that you have to have him as the guy. He's not like a heavy target for me, but when I get caught, and you get caught fairly frequently because that is a weak area, I do like him. I think he could be a guy, especially because you think about the Chargers offense and you think about his profile. It's very easy to imagine a scenario where he scores 15 touchdowns. And if he does that, both in terms of a full season and you think of like week 16, week 17, what are guys who could win you a big tournament? And Mike Williams is the guy.
Yep. That's where I've landed. But he goes right around DJ Moore, sometimes ahead of DJ Moore, and I want exposure to DJ Moore. I have him ranked behind Moore. I do have him ahead of, at this moment, Cortland Sutton and Jalen Waddle, who are the other two players I would reference in discussions with Williams that when I've thought through actual on-the-clock decisions and slow drafts and looked at those players in conjunction, like I said, I had Williams ranked higher, and I've gone Williams, but I've also wanted to go Sutton and Waddle. So he's being drafted around players that I don't want to not be exposed to. So it's hard. Like, I agree with you, but it's hard to get significantly overexposed to Williams. I have no Keenan Allen, and he even actually fell after all of these players in a draft I was in last week. The Draft Sharks Invitational was a fun draft, and I took Jalen Waddle over him. Kind of regretted that. I was like, yeah, that was probably the opportunity for me to get a share of Keenan Allen because I do want to get more Chargers. But yeah, as you just really well laid out. And the thing on Palmer, I also want to note, 15.3% targets per out run last year, not very good for a rookie. 7.8 yards per target, not that great, especially in an offense with a Justin Herbert who played really well. Wasn't even that efficient. Where he popped was in touchdowns. He had a really high touchdown rate last year, and maybe that's part of what Josh Palmer gets there on this year. But a 1.2 yards per out run as a rookie on almost 300 routes on his profile alone, and then with not a great production profile in college, was something we were concerned about with Palmer coming in. On his profile alone, feels more like a guy you tack onto a Justin Herbert stack in best ball than a guy that you're actively targeting as the breakout to fill this target void that we're concerned about potentially arising if Keenan Allen falls off or whatever happens. But I thought you explained that really well. I mean, the way that I'm hearing it is basically the way that I've been playing it. It's complicated, it's tricky, it's unfortunate, but winding up a little bit lower on the Chargers overall than either of us really want to be, getting some exposure to Mike Williams, who does feel like the best cost-adjusted price, even if he doesn't necessarily feel like a better pick sometimes than the player you take him over, just to get some exposure into the Chargers offense, because he does probably belong in that range at least. Williams, I'm with you. Played a little bit hurt. Saw the big jump in targets per out run. Has the air yards. Has the TD rate. Feels like the one that if Herbert really takes a step forward, has to come along. If he doesn't come along, he doesn't have a big year. I don't think Herbert has the great year. I don't think Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer are getting him, and Gerald Everett are getting him there. It feels like Mike Williams is a key to this idea that we're going to be right on the Chargers and they're going to be this incredibly fun offense and Justin Herbert's going to contend for the MVP. That's going to require Mike Williams, I think. So I do think we've solved that problem. It is annoying, the overall situation. I wish they would have got someone fun in there, a third receiver that I felt like had this great breakout profile, and all he has to beat out is Josh Palmer and Jalen Guyton for routes. All right, like I'll take that guy all day.